seems I can now share my screen. Up. That's right. Yay, it's correct. Let's go back here though for our start frame. Line that up, minimize that, find the other page, move it to where I can see it. Now I can keep track of any YouTube questions and Zoom questions, and we're in good shape. Maybe. Hold on. There we go. All right. And it only took about a minute. Not too bad. Okay, so we are going to resume our study of the end of days. And as I mentioned last time in our first session, this is not an easy topic. Everybody that knocks on your door and hands you a pamphlet or tries to tell you that they have a plan and know exactly what's happening, this cannot be reduced to a pamphlet. This cannot be reduced to simple slogans. We did see, however, certain themes that were repeatedly referenced throughout the Siddur, which was our launching point to find familiar clues or clues within familiar texts to what Judaism has as an idea regarding the end of days. And these themes are ones that need much more development, because just because you read the word doesn't mean that you understand it, and especially if the word has a lot of other use in other languages or other theologies. But in short, to recap from last time, it seems like our Siddur talks about some form of redemption. Redemption, remembering in Hebrew, especially biblical Hebrew, means to redeem somebody from captivity or slavery, and also to pursue justice on behalf of those that have been injured. There also is a definite theme of return. We've been in exile twice, and certainly the return from Babylon was very instructive, and we are technically in exile now. This will come back in much more detail when we discuss the role of the modern state of Israel in different conceptions of the end of days. We also know that there is a restorational idea within much of the language of the end of days, often focusing on the house of David, but certainly on focusing on independence and sovereignty for the Jewish people, not being under foreign and oppressive rule. However, most dominant throughout all of this is an emphasis on God's reign. While we talk about a restoration of the house of David and its kingship, and we'll leave that in quotes, we definitely are very clear on our aspirations of a godly kingship, a godly rulership of not just us, but also the world. And we'll be talking about that a lot throughout this entire program. And then there was also much discussion of the restoration of life to those that have already died. And finally, we see the word used most commonly and least transparently for modern English speakers of saving, salvation, often translated as deliverance in order to avoid the saving connotations in modern English. This is an idea of an end of suffering. Certainly, the Exodus from Egypt was the ultimate paradigm of that type of salvation, but it is clear that we are looking for other types of final salvation for all. Now, you might have been wondering, why did we start with the Siddur rather than Tanakh? Normally, for those of you that have studied with me before, you know I have a love of chronology. I like to show the origin and development of different things. For example, when we discussed the origin and the development of the Seder. However, because the concepts of the end of times within Judaism are rather unfamiliar and easily confused, for many that are not familiar with it, I wanted to show where you could find references to everything we would be discussing in what is perhaps the most familiar text. If you come to services at all, or if you use the Siddur on your own, you will see these phrases again and again. So I wanted to make sure that you were anchored in that text, understand that what we were discussing was well attested to within classic and universally accepted Judaism, and to see how it matters for our day-to-day reflections. But clearly, how we conceive of the end matters enough that it is throughout our daily liturgy and is intended clearly to be providing some guidance and benefit each and every day. These are not meant to be purely obscure discussions. Okay, with all of that being done and said, we do need to go to the Tanakh because ultimately the Jewish concepts of the end of days derives from the revelation, derives from what God has revealed to us through God's prophets. And the prophets' works are found in the Tanakh. We have a canon literature. There is a particular Bible that we use and have used now for more than 2,000 plus years, depending upon which book we're talking about, as some were added. But the closing of the canon is at least about 2,500 years old. And within this book, we find references that inspired everything that we see in the Siddur. However, that doesn't mean that just reading Tanakh will give you a perfectly clear understanding. We are going to go through today and probably next session as well, for at least part of it, some of the more famous texts that relate to the end of days. But understand that there are chapters and chapters and chapters of additional texts that either are very similar or parallel in other ways to the ones that we'll be looking at. But even with all of these texts, we will see that there is not a clear timeline. There is not a clear portrayal of exactly what events are definitely happening. And there is definitely some, what will appear to be mutually contradictory themes with regards to the end of days. Now, I say appear very importantly. We are going to pivot after we finish our survey of Tanakh literature into rabbinic literature, and we will see the rabbis debate, discuss, and distill the different ideas that are found in the Tanakh, and they will reconcile those types of contradictions. But as I have said a countless number of times at this point in my rabbinic career, going on 20 years now, just reading the text is not enough. That is a very foreign concept to Judaism. It is a very foreign concept to most traditions around the world of any type. But you do need to engage with this a little more deeply than a surface reading. That being said, I do want to look at the surface of the different texts in order to, one, highlight that it is not 100% transparent in and of itself, and two, prepare us with some of the more famous passages that will be at the heart of rabbinic discussion and elaboration. Okay, enough of an introduction for today. Let's get to work because we've got a bunch to get through. And like I said, we're probably not going to finish all the Tanakh text today. So be prepared to tune in next time. So we're going to start with Isaiah. And honestly, we could go through almost the entirety of Isaiah and still be discussing amazing insights that he just by himself is providing towards this topic. However, if we did that, we would not have time for any of the other teachers. And in the end, I would still be relying upon classical Jewish interpretation, which is where I want us to get next. So we're going to do just some selections from Isaiah, as well as bring in many of his other fellow prophets, so that we are not dependent only on one source. So beginning in the second chapter of Isaiah, we read the following. In the days to come. All right, so that is a key phrase. It's not obligatory, but you will see that phrase come up a lot. This is a standard prophetic introduction, and very often this phrase, in the days to come or on that day, is an introduction to a prophecy that is usually ascribed to being connected to the end of times. Not merely an event that will happen within the prophet's lifetime or sometime in the future of that prophet, but not at the end of time. So when we see in the days to come, usually we're looking long term. It's not a slam dunk. It's not 100% as a reliable indicator. The prophets were not always writing as technicians, and therefore their language and expression is not always reducible to a formula. But I think we'll agree in this particular case, it does appear to be pointing long term. In the days to come, The mount of God's house, that's the Temple Mount, where the temple once stood, shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all nations shall gaze on it with joy. All right, so we're going to do sort of a surface skim of the different themes that we see here. We'll also take note of things that are confusing or open to interpretation. So obviously, we're talking about some form of elevation of the Temple Mount. That is where God's house stood in the time of Isaiah. It's almost inconceivable he would be pointing this at something else. However, saying that it is above the mountains and towering over the hills seems a little bit of a misnomer. Although it is certainly a high point within the Jerusalem area, it is not the tallest mountain even in the land of Israel, and certainly not within that region, and obviously not the tallest mountain elsewhere. And we get our first question of, is this prophetic statement meant to be taken literally? Ah, that great word, literally. So many people in the last 200 years have decided that they will proclaim their faith by taking the words of God literally, as though that's what God wanted. God shakes his head and sighs because I don't think that we would be well served to imagine that our vision of the end of days has to entail the center of Jerusalem being elevated by 30,000 feet in order to be higher than Mount Everest. It's just not meant. Instead, when we say it's above the mountains and towering over the hills and standing firm, we're talking about a place of security, like a refuge would be made on a mountain. See Masada in Israel for a very good example of that. That this is a position of strength, of no subjugation, and that this is also something that is lasting, hence the stand firm idea. So mountains and high places were often used in that kind of metaphor throughout biblical poetry, and it would be really egregious to try and force this into some literal meaning. God, I hate that word, because clearly we are not meant to only get a superficial read from the text that God gave us. How much more could we denigrate the gift that God did than not looking past a simple picture and drawing it as though we were a 5-year-old with a box of crayons? All right, sorry, off my soapbox and back to the pulpit. Notice the second half of the verse. The nations shall gaze on it with joy. Clearly, Isaiah is considering that this is not going to be a triumph just for the Jewish people. We will see other prophecies that focus on Israel and the Jews in particular, but Isaiah here seems to be indicating that this stage of the world history will also be of benefit and recognized benefit for the other nations of the world. In fact, the many people shall go and say, "Come, let us go up to the mount of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, that we may be instructed in God's ways, and that we may walk in God's paths." It seems that the people around the world of all the nations are going to look towards Jerusalem and look towards God for instruction. Now, we're going to have to come back to this idea of instructed in God's ways. Are we talking specifically about Torah, or are we talking about learning how to connect to God through the model of Judaism, even when someone is not Jewish? Obviously, the prophets are extremely opposed to idolatry, but that doesn't mean that there is only one way to reach God once idolatry has been swept away. This is a little bit ambiguous. We will talk about the other elements of that ambiguity when we look at other prophecies. However, note the next line here. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. For those of you that are familiar shul goers, you will recognize this as part of the Torah service. Torah. This is the line that we sing as the ark has been opened and the Torahs are in front of us and we are about to begin our procession. And you may not have realized that this line contained within our Torah service is actually an invitation and an aspiration that Torah, instruction, the literal translation, there's that word again, that the Torah will be of use to the entire world, that this is something that will be sought by the entire world. So even as we are drawing close to the Torah for our own liturgical reading, we are also reminding ourselves that this is a gift that God is trying to give to the world in one form or another. We'll leave that as our asterisk. Thus, God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. And a sentiment that's echoed again in the prophet Micah, which we will look at in a little bit. So the second half here is making a very interesting statement about international relations, one that would have been interesting back in my my undergraduate days as a political science major. It seems to be implying that God will serve as an arbiter, as a judge, as one that makes decisions among the different peoples, and that consequently, we will no longer have need of war. They seem to be understanding, say the prophet Isaiah seems to understand through this prophecy that one of the main causes of war is when there are two states or more that have different ideas about what is fair and what is right over a particular issue or topic, and they cannot come to a mutually agreed upon resolution. Since they can't come on to that resolution, they then fight a war to force a resolution that was not reached through negotiation. If there is a universally accepted standard of what is fair and what is right, if people are able to turn to a source that all are happy to accept as being a correct source of mediation, then we don't need war anymore. War disappears. And we can take all of those implements that were made for war and turn them into implements for growth, for productivity, for providing for ourselves and for others. Hence the plowshares and pruning hooks. And in fact, we won't even need to know war again, or in other translations, we won't need to learn war anymore, because what would we gain by war? Right? We will get the best and most fair solution, as we all recognize through this understanding of God's arbitration, rather than by going to battle. That seems to be the vision that Isaiah is portraying here. So what have we seen in this idea? Well, one, we have a strong and a protected Judaism, certainly centered in Jerusalem. We have a universal end to conflict and suffering, and instead there is fairness and justice that is being dispensed for all nations. And all nations are being connected to God somehow. Again, there's a lot of questions left here of exactly how this is implemented and how this is created. But those basic conditions that will be established, the end result, if you will, that seems to be quite clear here in the words of Isaiah. However, Isaiah has a lot more to say, and if we turn to chapter 11, we will see one of the most famous and misquoted sections of his prophecies. And along the way, we're going to find many references that are rather important to us. But a shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse. Wait, hold on. That language sounds familiar. What was it about growing and sprouting and plants? Well, you may remember when we discussed the Siddur, that we see that theme of sprouting, of growing, of putting forth a shoot as a common metaphor for redemption, for the good that will come at the end of days. And lo and behold, here we see Isaiah, among many other prophetic statements, using exactly that type of language. The Siddur very rarely will invent new phrasing. It might give a new twist to old phrasing. It might juxtapose familiar forms together so that it creates some additional meaning, but it rarely picks up poetry entirely on its own. And here we see that. Now, you might be asking, what is this stump of Jesse? Well, that is a reference to the house of David. If you've ever been out in a forest and you've seen a tree that either fell or was cut down and the stump still remains, if you go back year after year, you may see that sometimes that stump will send forth a new shoot. And this is an incredibly powerful metaphor for the ancient people, and should be for us as well. That even something that looks like it has been completely killed and destroyed, just a dead old stump, the tree is surely gone. In time, can still blossom, flourish, and send forth a new shoot, a new growth. Now, why Jesse? Well, Jesse was David's father. And so David is often referred to as the son of Jesse. It's one of the many poetic titles for him. And to build off that metaphor, a twig shall sprout from his stock, meaning from among his descendants. So this again speaks to that idea that there will be a Davidic king or Davidic leader, if we're uncomfortable with kingship as a technical term, that will figure prominently. Now, this is this is one of the many references to this individual, and since people that were leaders or royalty in the ancient world were anointed, it is perhaps not surprising that we refer to this figure as Mashiach, as being the Messiah, which simply means anointing or anointed. So when you see something talking about the son of Jesse, the scion of Jesse, the stock of Jesse, or about a sprout growing from the stump or the barren land, recognize that these are all references to Mashiach, to somebody that will be appointed, anointed as a special leader at this time. And what will happen? Well, the Spirit of God shall alight upon him, a spirit of wisdom and insight, a spirit of counsel and valor, a spirit of devotion and reverence for God. This is going to be a special guy. He is going to have an ability to connect and understand God that is going to be impressive, to say the least. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for God. Whoa. And someone making a phone call to me. Sorry, I should have put that on note. Don't disturb. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for God. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. Again, just basic understanding here seems to be in line with the plot of the Torah. Is he's not going to do just what he wants or thinks. He's not even going to be limited only by what he is able to perceive empirically, but he will be guided by his understanding of God. And that means that he will have a special capacity for judging. Now, judging in the ancient world was not just like judging in the modern world with somebody in a black robe with a gavel. That person merely arbitrates the cases that come before them, but we don't expect much from them. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a hard job and an important one, but it is a very niche role within society. A shofet, a judge in classical Judaism, was much more responsible for the leadership of the entire people, as you see from the book of Judges, one of the books of Tanakh that takes place after the stories of Joshua. So here, this person is not just sitting on a bench and with a gavel. They are leading in this way. And what will happen? Well, because of this leadership and judgment, thus he shall judge the poor with equity and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. Does that mean he will be showing favoritism to the poor? No. Again, in context with the treatment of the poor in the time of the prophets, it was very clear that if you were not well-to-do, you were unlikely to get a fair shake by the local judges during the times of Isaiah. That many of the prophets complain of the ill treatment of the poor, that when they had a complaint or a problem or a case that came before the judges of those days, they were not heard fully and they were not given true justice. They were not being vindicated when they truly were in the right. This person, this Mashiach, will judge fairly, even the poor, and will do justice even for the lowly of the land. Justice will be universal, and those who have been cut out of the current system of justice will be brought in, so they too are being handled properly and fairly. And that means he shall strike down a land with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Again, a good case where we're not looking at hyperliteralism. We don't expect that his breathing on people is going to cause them to drop dead. Instead, what we seem to be seeing here is that somebody who is giving good instruction and teaching, who is speaking the truth that God wants in the world, will cause an end to wickedness and to evil. If people are doing wrong things and he is holding them accountable through justice, well, they're out of luck, right? They are being struck down by his decrees, by his rulings, and those indeed are coming from his mouth, from out of his lips. Justice shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his waist. He will be strong and resolute. All right, and now the very famous and misquoted section. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, baby goat, the calf and the beast of prey and the fatling together with a little child to herd them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. The lion, like the ox, shall eat straw. A babe shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass its hand over an adder's den. In all of my sacred mount, nothing evil or vile shall be done, for the land shall be filled with devotion to God as water covers the sea. Okay, incredibly powerful, incredibly stirring. You'll also notice it never says lion and lamb. That is an English alliteration error that has crept into our common idiomatic expression. The same way that people will say the proof is in the pudding, which is not what the original phrase was either in English, which is the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But let's focus on what was actually said. Do we believe that this is a hyper-literal discussion, that actual lions are going to be eating straw, that actual child will be able to handle major beasts of prey together with their prey, and this will be perfectly fine? The general understanding within Judaism is that we understand these verses with the verse that concludes this section, that nothing evil or vile will be done, that these are metaphors for different types of people, that there will be the people that have been prey, and there are people who have been predators, and the predators will no longer prey upon the weak. They will no longer prey upon the poor, for example, or the lowly of the land that we mentioned just a couple of verses ago. That instead, they will actually be together. They will not be fighting or taking advantage of one another or causing suffering to one another, because everyone will have a devotion to God. Somehow, that's an important ambiguity, the people of this generation will have recognized God's essence enough, or clearly enough, or consistently enough, that their devotion won't falter, and so they will not act like predators upon each other, and that all people who had been on the lowest or the highest will instead be now seen as fair and equitable human beings, treating each other properly and not perpetuating the suffering that has plagued society for, well, 10,000 plus years. Okay, so that seems to be the focus here of his vision. Notice we still have a lot of uncertainty of how all of this is going to take place. Is the Messiah just giving it down good rulings? Is he fighting to make this happen? Do the rulings imply some type of punishment? Is that punishment what's essential? Is it what's essential the devotion? Is the devotion voluntary, or is there some compulsion happening here? Is God overriding free will? These are questions that are still swirling in the back of the mind about how this happens. What it looks like, how it will feel, that seems pretty clear in Isaiah's mind. But the steps to get there still seem a little bit, unrevealed. But let's read a little more of what Isaiah says here in chapter 11. In that day, the stock of Jesse, again, talking a descendant of David, Messiah, Mashiach, that has remained standing. Everybody thought that they're basically not wiped out, but completely shaken, shall become a standard to peoples. Remember that the word standard here in English is not a standard like a level of expectation. This is a standard like a banner. The standard bearer is a modern English expression that still uses that feeling in English. This is somebody who will be a flag that others will look to and will rally around. Nations shall seek his counsel, and his abode shall be honored. So the other nations of the world will honor him and will come to him for guidance. Maybe we got a little more of a clue here that this is not being accomplished through violence, but this is being accomplished simply by being such an outstanding person that the other nations of the world will recognize that gift and will willingly seek that counsel, and that will help smooth things out. Like we saw before, nation shall not lift up sword. In that day, my sovereign will apply the divine hand again to redeeming the other part of his people from Assyria, also from Egypt, Parthos, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and the coastlands, all the distant lands of the ancient East, used here to describe the exiled and dispersed people. God will hold up a signal to the nations and assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Here we go. Now we're talking about a redemption. Now we're talking about the ingathering of the exiles, something again we saw much of in our Siddur. Then Ephraim's envy shall cease, and Judah's harassment shall end. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. All right. If you're not familiar with the stand-in terminology for the ancient Jewish states, let me explain. After the death of Solomon, when his son Rehoboam took over, he was a bad king. We'll leave it at that. And he was such a bad king that the nation was split by civil war, and you ended up with the northern nation of Israel and the southern nation of Judah. Judah was focused around the tribe of Judah's land and, of course, the city of Jerusalem, whereas the northern nation was focused around, usually referred to by Ephraim, the dominant clans from the north. Ephraim was the largest population in the northern tribes. So oftentimes the prophets will speak of Ephraim to mean the north and Judah to mean the south when they are talking about these two parts of the Jewish people that have been fighting by the time Isaiah comes along for a couple hundred years and fought for quite some time. So the idea that they will be reconciled is an idea that the different elements of Judaism will be brought into harmony with one another. That this is not only bringing peace to the rest of the nations, this is also bringing peace to ourselves. They shall pounce on the back of Philistia to the west, and together plunder the peoples of the east. Wait, that doesn't sound nice. Edom and Moab shall be subject to them, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. God will dry up the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and will raise a hand over the Euphrates with a mighty wind, and break it into 7 wadis, so that it can be trodden dryshod. Wait, the Euphrates, the major river in the Babylonian territories, is going to be ruined? Thus there shall be a highway for the other part of Israel out of Assyria, such as there was for this people when it left the land of Egypt. Oh, we're talking about redemption here, and we're modeling it off Egypt redemption. Just like we crossed through from the sea when we left Egypt, so too we will be able to cross when we are leaving the other places of our disbursement, that we will find our return just as miraculously supported as it was during the time of our Egyptian exodus. Okay, so the second half, well, you're working with me here, right? Obviously, I already understood this. Please just, we're working this through as though we were reading it together for the first time. What we are talking about in the second half of this portion is the idea that there will be a return, and God is going to provide miraculous support for that return in order that it be as easy as possible. Because you might be thinking, if the people come back from all these scattered countries, that's going to be a problem. And the prophet is pointing out, it wasn't a problem when we left Egypt. It won't be a prophet when this happens as well. Now, the other section, that there's going to be pouncing on Philistia, the Philistine territories along the coast, and that there will be plunder against the other nations to the east. Well, that is something that we're going to have to put a bookmark on, because is this indicating that there will actually need to be violence, that when the Messiah comes, there will be conflict? But I thought the nations were coming to him for counsel. I thought that people weren't learning war anymore. I thought that there was devotion to God, filling the world like waters over the sea. What's this fight about? And it's not explained in much detail in context. And that is something we're going to have to work with. That ambiguity is something that we're going to have to try to handle. But recognize that it is there. That in addition to the visions of peace that Isaiah gave us in the 2 passages we've already got, there is also visions of conflict. and there is vision of fighting. And it is not so simple to just say everything's going to be peaceful and tickety-boo. There is definitely an element within this section of prophecy that the end of days might or will or must, and we don't know yet, contain some type of violence. But to whom we direct that violence and why has definitely not been made clear at this point. So keep that in mind as we go forward, because we're going to look at an extended quote from the prophet Zechariah, where this topic becomes more developed, and we can see some of the things that he is probably referring to. All right, before we continue, though, I need to just take a drink of my tea. Okay, so Zechariah lived during the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. He was one of the very last prophets that we received, and as such, it also helps us because his prophecy cannot be misunderstood as being applicable for the return from the Babylonian exile, which began in 586. He lived at the end of that period after the Persians had overthrown the Babylonians and allowed us to return. So one of the problems from the earlier prophets, such as Isaiah, is oftentimes we will have to debate and sometimes not be able to come to a firm resolution whether or not their prophecy was meant for their day or meant for their near-term future or within a couple hundred years of their future, or whether it is reserved for the end of times, which remains in the future, even to us now 2,000 plus years since then. Zechariah is a little easier. There is still a question of whether it was his near term, but if he is talking, for example, about a return from abroad, well, that already happened. So he wouldn't be referring to the return from Babylon. He would have to be referring to a return from Jews from some future exile, the exile that we're currently living through. So it gives us a little bit more confidence that that's what he's talking about. But as always, we have to be prepared for the humility that allows us to have a little ambiguity in these texts. But let's go ahead and take a look at chapters 13 and 14. I know it's a long chunk, and we'll see what we can glean from this that we can feel confident about, and what still needs more reconciliation and clarity. In that day, there's our language again. In that day, a fountain shall be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem for purging and cleansing. So house of David is mentioned again. Seems like another reference to some sort of messianic figure, or at the very least, Jewish independence by having our own sovereign king. And the idea of purging and cleansing is the idea that there would be a spring, a mikveh, that would allow for ritual purification, which is a very important thing when the temple still stood. In that day, too, declares the Lord of hosts, I will erase the very names of the idols from the land. They shall not be uttered anymore. So we're not just talking about a ritual purification within a mikveh. We are talking about a spiritual purification to get rid of idolatry, something that was less of a problem during Zechariah's time, but was still hanging around. And I will also make the prophets and the unclean spirit vanish from the land. If anyone prophesies thereafter, his own father and mother who brought him into the world will say to him, you shall die, for you have lied in the name of the Lord. And his own father and mother who brought him into the world will put him to death when he prophesies. And that day, every prophet will be ashamed of the visions he had when he prophesied. In order to deceive, he will not wear a hairy mantle, and he will declare, I am not a prophet, I am a tiller of the soil. You see, I was plied with the red stuff from my youth on. And if he is asked, what are those sores on your back? He will reply, from being beaten in the home of my friends. Okay, so Zechariah is clearly unhappy with the type of prophets that have been going around. Many people were prophesying, claiming to be prophets, and were making all sorts of statements that were satisfying to their clientele. The same way that somebody who in the modern world might pretend to be a fortune teller will often make sure to give tellings that are going to improve their fortunes rather than the fortune of the person who has the query. We have had people like that since time immemorial. And he is saying that at some time in that day, the prophets that are like that will no longer be doing that kind of prophecy. You should also note here, although we don't have time to go into it in too much detail, that after the time of Zechariah and the final prophets, Judaism does not look for actual prophets, that we believe the age of prophecy is done, that God is not going to lift up a new prophet that would speak to us like Isaiah or Zechariah or the others that we'll read from. And as such, we are very skeptical of people who claim that they have had a vision and this is what God is telling them to tell us. And all we have to do is give them our bank details. And we're very, very skeptical of that type of activity. But Zechariah is talking even more stridently against these types of false prophets. And he continues in a relatively militant way. O sword, rouse yourself against my shepherd, the man in charge of my flock, says the Lord of hosts. Strike down the shepherd and let the flock scatter, and I will also turn my hand against all the shepherd boys. Throughout the Lord, declares the Lord, throughout the land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall perish, shall die, and 1/3 of it shall survive. That third I will put into the fire, and I will smelt them as one smelts silver, and test them as one tests gold. They will invoke me by name, and I will respond to them. I will declare, you are my people, and they will declare, the Lord is our God. Okay. This seems to be talking about a catastrophe happening to the Jewish people, where 2/3 of the people are destroyed in this conflict, hence the sword, and the people who have been shepherding are thrown out. Apparently they were illegitimate or negligent shepherds, as well as the people who work for them, the shepherd boys. But in the end, this 1/3 remnant, and remnant is a classic end of days reference throughout Jewish teachings, will survive, but they will have gone through a smelting process. If you're not familiar with metalworking, smelting is where you will take the ore and you will heat it and purify it and heat it and purify it, and skimming off all of the impurities, all of the dross, the bad stuff, in order to make it as pure as possible. Hence the smelting and testing of silver and gold. And in the end, God will recognize this remnant as truly being his people, and they will recognize God as being their God. And every time you see the word Lord in this translation, it's usually referring to the ineffable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, what is usually said as Adonai, that they will refer to Adonai as their God. All right, now chapter 14 continues with the difficult times. Lo, a day for the Lord is coming, when your spoil shall be divided in your very midst. All right, that's not a good thing. Right? Your spoil means other people will attack you and be looting you, and you'll have to sit there and watch them take the loot away from you, take all of your property away from you, and haggle over who gets what share amongst themselves while you sit there. For I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem for war. Sounds a little different than Isaiah. The city shall be captured, the houses plundered, and the women violated, and a part of the city shall go into exile. But the rest of the population shall not be uprooted from the city. So some are going to go, some are going to stay. It's going to be awful for everybody. Then the Lord will come forth and make war on those nations, as he is wont to make war on a day of battle, meaning those that had attacked us will then be attacked. On that day, he will set his feet on the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall split across from east to west. And one part of the mount shall lift to the north and the other to the south, a huge gorge. There'll be a valley. And the valley and the hills shall be stopped up, for the valley of the hills shall reach only to Azal. It shall be stopped up as it was stopped up as a result of an earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. And the Lord my God, with all the holy beings, will come to you. Okay. The vision gets very, very violent and a little confusing. So we've got God apparently arriving and putting feet on the Mount of Olives, which is still in Jerusalem to the east, and the mountain having a huge geological cataclysm where it splits so that part of it goes to the north and part of it goes to the south. And now there is an east-west valley that is going through it. And somehow God and heavenly beings are showing up through this time. Now, Judaism does not put any stock in the idea of God being a physical creature. We talk about God's arm, we talk about God's hand, we talk about God's nose, eyes, and ears all the time, but it seems very clear throughout both Torah, Tanakh, and rabbinic literature that we do not believe God has any of those bodily parts. So what might this mean? Well, certainly it means that there is a war. Certainly it means that God will be fighting both against us at the start, allowing the plunder and spoils of the city to go to this foreign attacker, but also that God will be somehow participating in a fight against those people as well. And that there is going to be some sort of geological catastrophe, or do we read the splitting of the mountain as being the same as the splitting of the waters that Isaiah referred to, with the notion that there will be a miracle that allows things to proceed more smoothly? Perhaps this is meant as a metaphor for allowing the exiles to return more easily to Jerusalem by not having to go over that final mountain, that final barrier that they would have to scale in order to reach Jerusalem in ancient days. It's not 100% clear. But he continues, in that day there shall be neither sunlight nor cold moonlight. There shall be a continuous day. Only the Lord knows when. Of neither day nor night, and there shall be light at eventide. In that day, fresh water shall flow from Jerusalem, part of it to the eastern sea and part of it to the western sea, meaning the Mediterranean, the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, respectively, throughout the summer and winter. Even though many springs would dry up, this one is not. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord with one name. All right, so before we talk about that last phrase, we have to again wrestle. How literally do we take this? Are we actually looking for a new spring to be opened up that's going to have rivers flowing out of Jerusalem, one that goes down towards the Dead Sea and one that goes towards the Mediterranean? Or are we reading this metaphorically, like having a leopard sit down with a baby goat, where we're talking about there being a flowing out from Jerusalem of God's teaching, of God's righteousness, of God's judgment, and that is going to be eternal, and that is going to support the world. Indeed, the final line is about God being king over all the earth, having the metaphor of God supporting the entire world through this ever-flowing river, or rivers, heading in both the two main directions of the time, would certainly be an appropriate metaphor. In fact, it is such a powerful phrase in this final line that you might recognize it as being the concluding line of Aleinu. Aleinu, which we talked about last week, concludes with a very powerful statement of belief that at one point in the future, God will be king, or recognized as king, over all the earth, and that God will not just be one, because obviously we already believe God is one, but that people will all refer to God as the same God. Rather than thinking that their gods are competing, we will recognize that we are all children of the same God. Let's go ahead and continue, because we're not going to resolve this just today, because, well, other people have taken more than 2,000 years and it's still a little fuzzy. Then the whole king country shall become like the Arabah, from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. The latter, however, shall perch high up where it is, and shall be inhabited from the gate of Benjamin to the site of the old gate, down to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's winepresses. Never again shall destruction be decreed, and Jerusalem shall dwell secure. This seems again to be connecting some of the visions we saw for Isaiah and many of the things we saw in the Siddur of rebuilding Jerusalem, Jerusalem being safe, Jerusalem being prosperous. As for those people that warred against Jerusalem, remember we talked about them a little while ago, the Lord will smite them with this plague. What is that plague? Their flesh shall rot away while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall rot away in their sockets, and their tongues shall rot away in their mouths. In that day a great panic from the Lord shall fall upon them, and everyone shall snatch at the hand of another, and everyone shall raise his hand against them, everyone else's hand. All right, not pretty. Again, is this a metaphor or is this a literal illness that we're talking about here? Does it actually make a significant difference other than the fact of what's coming, which is greater contention? Certainly, we might think that if this was literal, it would be hard for people to actually be fighting each other. After all, if they can't speak and their eyes are gone and they can't stand and their feet are their bodies rotting away, then we might find it hard to apply this literally. Hasn't stopped some people, but I think we can have a little bit more discretion there. And then it continues, Judah shall join in the fighting in Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the nations round about, vast quantities of gold, silver, and clothing shall be gathered in. The same plague shall strike the horses, the mules, and camels, and the asses. The plague shall affect all the animals in those camps. All right. So again, we are being reminded that this is happening for those that we're fighting against. It's their military camps that are being affected, and all of their implements of war. The animals were part of their war machine, and that in the process, Judah will then fight. I mean, it's not only happening through God. There will be Jewish armies as well, and in the process of their winning, they will also be enriched, as was normal for classic battles in the ancient world when you had material wealth that could be seized during combat. And then let's finish Zechariah off for today. All who survive of all those nations that came up against Jerusalem shall make a pilgrimage year by year to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, and to observe the Feast of Booths, also known as Sukkot, which is when we read this Haftarah as part of our liturgy. So you might have thought that all of that rotting away meant that everybody else was gone, but here they are, those nations now coming to Jerusalem. Again, kind of echoing the idea that Isaiah had before, and recognizing that they are going to learn from God through the vehicle of Jerusalem. And coming on Sukkot seems like an interesting choice. Any of the earth communities that does not make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, shall receive no rain. Is this voluntary or is this obligatory? Are people inspired by God's goodness and by the righteous rule of whatever's going on in Jerusalem? Or are they being blackmailed into attending? It's a little unclear. Many people like to portray this as being a perfect kumbaya moment where everybody is simply celebrating together, and the text can support that. Others will like to put it in a more nationalistic tone, where Jerusalem is basically ruling the world and is able to coerce others to be obedient by threats of their prosperity, which is what rain represents. And then others will take it to be more middle of the road. The natural world is going to continue. It's only that God's role within it is going to be more apparent to more people. So, of course, people are going to want to make pilgrimage and want to celebrate Sukkot because they will recognize that their understanding of God is part of how they will prosper. That if they behave antithetically to God's morality, that the world itself will seem to deprive them of the prosperity that they wish. And then we get an interesting little aside that would have been really important to hear if you lived in the ancient world. However, if the community of Egypt does not make this pilgrimage, it shall not be visited by the same affliction with which the Lord will strike the other nations that do not come up to observe the feasts of booths. Why not? Because Egypt doesn't rely on rain. Egypt relies on the Nile. And within the classical borders of Egypt itself, rain wasn't that important. Rain obviously mattered to the headwaters of the Nile, but not so much in Egypt itself. So if you threaten Egypt, if you don't come, you don't get rain, they'd be like, oh no, what will we do? Oh, right, we wait for the Nile to flood. So this had to be in here so that we understood that it isn't just about rain. This is affecting everyone, even if they don't need rain. Such shall be the punishment of Egypt and of all of the nations that do not come up to observe the Feast of Booths. In that day, even the bells of the horses shall be inscribed holy to the Lord. And the metal pots in the house of the Lord shall be like the basins before the altar. Indeed, every metal pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all those who sacrifice shall come and take of these to boil the sacrificial meat in. In that day, there shall be no more traitors in the house of the Lord of hosts. This is talking about a great upswell of holiness that will be even more prevalent, more powerfully present than during the days of the normal temple, the temple that we know from history, that even the horses are going to be considered dedicated as servants to help God. Even the average pot is going to be important for that type of service. It's an idea of ultimate elevation of every aspect of society. All right. We are out of time for today, so we will continue with different prophecies next week. Hopefully you are good and confused, because if you think you understand all of this, then you're dangerous. Because I mean that from historical perspective, that people who think they know exactly what all of this means usually end up causing harm to themselves and others. But hopefully you are seeing some of the themes that we talked about from our last session cropping up. The idea of restoration, the idea of God's kingship, the idea of a Mashiach, of some sort of anointed person coming from David, the idea of redemption, of salvation, of peace, but also the idea that this may not be a cakewalk, that this may have many other issues and problems that will cause, well, war or devastation or conflict. And we will continue on that theme in our next session. And like I said, this is not meant to make you feel like you've got a handle on it, but make you feel like you might be able to get a handle on at least the most important ideas and how they apply to us. So stick with me. We'll touch on more prophecy next week. Take care, everyone, and be well.